1991 play, Angels in America, with the death of the main protagonist's Russian immigrant grandmother. At the funeral service, the rabbi, portrayed by Meryl Streep in the HBO adaptation, she really can't play anybody, says the following of the deceased. She was not a person, but a whole kind of person, the ones who crossed the ocean, who brought with us to America the villages of Russia and Lithuania, and how we struggled, and how we fought, for the family, for the Jewish home, so that you would not grow up here in this strange place, in the melting pot where nothing melted. Descendants of this immigrant woman, you do not grow up in America, for no such place exists. Your clay is the clay of some Litvak shtetl, or Jewish village. Your air, the air of the steppes, because she carried the old world on her back across the ocean in a boat. She put it down on Grand Concourse Avenue or in Flatbush, and she worked that earth into your bones, and you pass it to your children, this ancient, ancient culture and home. You can never make that crossing that she made, for such great voyages in this world do not anymore exist. But every day of your lives, the miles that voyage between that place and this one you cross. Every day, in you, that journey is. So, she was the last of the Mohicans, this one was. Pretty soon, all the old will be dead. When I think of the great voyages my own family has made from the smallest and poorest of the Soviet socialist republics to the unfamiliar suburbs of Elmwood Park and later Fair Lawn, New Jersey, I think of Kushner's quote. I think of the Soviet Jewish home in which I was raised, where kotlete and stuffed cabbage, blini and pickled tomatoes were my bread and butter, not to mention actual bread and butter, a nightly ritual with some raspberry tea. But beyond the comforts of my Jewish home, where the walls heal, or so the Russian saying goes anyway, in the melting pot where nothing melts, I find myself in something of an identity crisis. Despite having grown up in the most densely populated Russian-speaking town in the country, where we had not one but two Russian stores, where a Russian Jewish synagogue was meant to foster a sense of kin and community, and where 34% of the population was supposed to be exactly like me, I felt like a fish out of water. I have much fonder memories of my parents' home country. In Moldova, or the motherland, if you will, I find myself to be something of a Martian visitor, in that I have permission to be a subjective spectator, an outsider, a temporary boarder to observe, record, and think about my family's origin stories without entirely relating to them. I don't feel any particular connection to Moldovan Jews, to the soil, or to the increasingly modernizing capital. Instead, I think of the home in which my father spent his later adolescence and early adulthood, my grandmother's home. When I think of the universe in which my parents grew up, I think of my grandmother, the last surviving relic attaching me to a place in which I knew no home but hers. I think of her insistence to iron every article of clothing before my departure last year, despite my arguing that I did not need my boxer shorts steam ironed, though admittedly, they felt fantastic. I think of how one day, while slurping from our respective bowls of borscht, her hair caught fire, or how she woke me in the middle of the night one time to ask if I was cold. My Moldovan Jewishness is not defined by any particular label, but instead by memory. Memory of my grandmother's distinct style of cooking, one which involved stir-frying leftovers of stuffed grape leaves, salami, buckwheat, sour cream, tomato, essentially everything in the pantry, in a sort of mad dash and scramble to astonishingly delicious results, if not visually attractive ones. These are among the better pictures. I'm reminded of the pickling jars in her living room, stuffed to the brim, of the bed that she laboriously put together on the balcony before my visit. Memories of those who never left Moldova, or really never had to. I recall thinking the city resembled maquettes, models for some play that never went into production, where you can still see the old colorful storefronts in the foreground, replaced by capitalist behemoths behind, in the city's capital. Even deeper, one finds villages and slums where taxis are practically unheard of, but chickens cluck away. And then I think of him, the boy who stopped in his tracks at the sight of a city cab in his village, where a couple of well-dressed men snapped his picture from a moving taxi. I was immediately attracted to his Spider-Man t-shirt, which, like the Coca-Cola vending machines on the edge of the city and slums, reminded me that American capitalism was inescapable, even here, in my parents' home country. Perhaps he knew how familiar I was with the iconic web-shooting Peter Parker on his chest. An American found himself in his village, infiltrated, invaded. His gaze at the driver and nod at the camera almost says, how could you have brought him here? Returning to Kushner's quote, my parents worked their Soviet Jewish earth into my bones, passing on to me and my sister this ancient, ancient culture and home. But what was mine to inherit? To borrow from a recollection in Svetlana Alexievich's secondhand time, what's there to remember? I never grew up in the Soviet Union, nor the geopolitical landscape that followed. The Moldova my parents knew spoke the language of its umbrella government, but Romanian has since replaced Russian as the language of the people, a language we do not speak. My parents never practiced their Jewish faith in the USSR, nor did they upon coming to America. So what connection do I have to this culture? Why is it that upon being asked what I am, I instinctively respond Russian Jew, when technically speaking, neither term fully applies? While this question is beyond me, it was not beyond Marion Hirsch and Leo Spitzer, who coined the term post-memory in the 1990s. Post-memory describes the relationship that the generation after bears to the personal, collective, and cultural trauma of those who came before, to experiences they remember only by means of the stories, images, and behaviors among which they grew up. But these experiences were transmitted to them so deeply and effectively as to seem to constitute memories in their own right. Post-memory's connection to the past is thus mediated not by recall, but by imaginative investment, projection, and creation. To grow up with overwhelming inherited memories, to be dominated by narratives that preceded one's birth or one's consciousness, is to risk having one's own life stories displaced, even evacuated, by our ancestors. It is to be shaped, however indirectly, by traumatic fragments of events that still defy narrative reconstruction and exceed comprehension. So these events happened in the past, but their effects continue to the present. I like to use Hirsch and Spitzer's definition of post-memory in a cynical way, to remind my parents of this quote-unquote cultural trauma they have impressed onto me, this feeling of Soviet Jewishness when I was born in Ridgewood and last stepped into a temple in 2011, a skeptic. Consider me culturally traumatized. Like my parents' generation, who burdened the legacy of the Holocaust from their own mothers and fathers' experience, I too am part of a generation after, left to make sense of what happened and relate to it. But how could I, when the stories my family told me were stained with images of an oppressive communist regime? When anecdotes of childhood, friendships, college years, parties were overtaken by recollections of an anti-Semitic government they were only more conscious of after moving to the country that hails itself the world's premier democracy? How is it that despite growing up in well-to-do families with happy childhoods, my family members cannot help describing their lives in the Soviet Union as oppressed by a force that they did not experience to the degree they describe now? These are the questions that fascinate me deeply as a budding oral historian. Not the objective fact of the matter, but the biased, twisted, subjective. To take into account and reveal subjectivity in affect, writes Leo Spitzer of his own historical practice, to consider what is remembered as well as what is forgotten, fears as well as imaginings, the apprehension and misapprehension of events, complicates and restores a measure of contingency to history. Australian historian Greg Diening wrote that we never know the truth by being told it. We have to experience it in some way. That is the abiding grace of history. It is in the theater that we know the truth. Diening argues here that performance, or rather re-performance of history, is the only outlet through which we can take something away from it, make meaning, understand. If imaginative investment, projection, and creation are required to better understand those who came before us, then my task was clear. I would have to step into my family's shoes more intimately and invasively than I ever dared go before. My thesis, entitled Secondhand Vision, and bear with me for this academic synopsis, is at its core a personal artistic exploration of my being a first-generation American. Through photography and film, theatrical performance, oral and cultural histories, and the history of art, I studied the ways in which we construct and reconstruct our own narratives and identities as they're diverted through the prism of memory. What is the generational role of children of immigrants in remembering, identifying with, and preserving the cultures and responsibilities of their ancestral lineage? How do we construct cultural identity and from it fabricate myth? How do we inherit it? How do we remember it? For me, the answer lies in performing for the camera through photography and film. These are the stories of my Russian life. Performance and play have long been scandalous. Famous exponents of the anti-theatrical prejudice include Plato, Socrates, and the Puritans. They felt that the theater can use its suspense of reality to make audiences believe in, if only for a moment, to use a contemporary term, fake news. The convincing sincerity of actors in an effort to make viewers believe that spectacle is truth was deemed dangerous. You would be mistaken to believe that these fears are restricted to ancient times. In fact, only 2 years after the signing of the Declaration of Independence, in the middle of the American Revolutionary War, the US Congress condemned all theatrical representation together with gambling and horse racing. 100 years later, actors were still being denied Christian burial in New York. My views lie with John Witherspoon of Princeton, a founding father of the United States who argued the opposite, that the stage was dangerous not because it presented fraud, but because it might show you that which is only too true. Better for the world, he wrote, that several ancient facts and characters which now stand upon record had been buried in oblivion. How tempting it is to forget. Buried in oblivion are history and those who experienced it. Preserved, idealized, and immortalized only in family photographs and stories, our relatives fade into myth or anecdote, and ultimately into misinterpretations and educated guesses. Losing a grandparent often means losing any possible access to times long gone. Performance and photography can thus help to uncover that which has been buried. Since beginning this thesis, I've taken a renewed interest into my family's own photo archive. Although I did manage to track some relatives down through 23andMe, I was far more successful by word of mouth. Simply asking my grandmother who was depicted in any particular photo and where their descendants live today has led me to discover a whole branch of paternal cousins that reside in London. One of them even teaches Soviet Jewish history and geography at Oxford. My mother's cousins apparently live in New Zealand. And of course, these are the more obscure immigrations, many relocated to Austria, Germany, or Israel. Dozens of other relative stories remain untold or forgotten. Their personal histories, but likewise the passions and rivalries, the tensions, anxieties, and problems, basically Thanksgiving, inherent in family relations, that have for the most part remained on the edges or outside the family album. These go forgotten. Thus it is up to the generations that follow them to imagine what these eerily familiar yet unavailable relatives might have been like. We've all done it, impressed our own ideas of what our great, etc. grandparents lived through based on a handful or even a single photograph. In an effort to identify subjects in a photograph and reimagine what their lives might have been like, artists have long attempted to use the camera, the album, and the familial gaze as modes of questioning, resistance, and contestation, writes Hirsch, interrogating not only family itself, but traditions of representation. The family photo album is an extraordinary point of interest, not only because it encapsulates and outlines entire lives and witnesses global histories, but also because family photo archives trace the entire history of photography itself. In these albums and these collections, one might find images ranging from daguerreotypes and early 20th century prints, to Polaroids, photos produced on home printers, all the way to digital images taken on the smartphone. And I refrain from saying iPhone for all of you very strange Android users out there. The work I'm about to show you now is new and only in its infancy. It's exciting, yet sensitive, personal, but incomplete. I'm creating a fictional family photo archive, sometimes recreating, sometimes referencing my own family's albums, in an effort to understand who was photographed, where, when, and how were these photographs curated in family albums, preserved and carefully organized for future generations. The album will go from the early 20th century to the present. This is only the beginning of a body of images, but I do hope that it's a good start. It stems from a long history of performing for the camera, a rich 180-year story I've only just begun to think about. And I'm still trying to figure out how to talk about it coherently. The process of creating these images and films has drained me of my sanity, self-confidence, and energy as only art can do. So perhaps that means it's working. I started with this photograph on the left, most likely taken in Moldova somewhere, depicting a distant relative I have yet to identify. And the image has all of the connotations one associates with the old country. The white scarf, kitsch printed dress, faded background, and of course the babushka center frame. On the right poses her 21st century counterpart, an interpretation of her likeness brilliantly performed by a descendant, namely my 16-year-old sister. This recreation is the only connection we have to this woman we are related to. And in recreating her portrait, we engage in a sort of dialogue. and in effect collapse distance and time as the pixels of my digital photograph replace the grain of the original film. Other photographs transported me out of the studio and into the shtetl, or Jewish village, and allowed me to recreate more candid or vernacular portraits, informal but intimate documents of relatives in context. A popular cast of two Jewish figurines, an older couple carrying what is likely the Torah, served as my subjects. Here, the grandmother figurine portrays my great-great-grandmother, Mariasin. The illusion will only be more convincing when I print these photographs to the size of the original source material. Seeing as the time machine has not yet been invented, I have to rely on surrogates to produce my photograph, stand-ins for the real thing. In the same way that I can never truly know the lives of my long-gone family members, and have to impress my own filtered imaginings on what they were like, figurines, mannequins, and masks are blank slates awaiting meaning. They are no more real than the relatives in my family photo albums, and both allow me to fabricate narratives as I see fit, to perform and play. These particular figures have an intriguing backstory. I snagged them from a garage sale a number of years ago, thinking that I had the only pair in the world, but since starting this project have spied their replicas everywhere. Thus, they act as a sort of archetypal representation of the 19th and 20th century Jewish person. Iconic portraits produced en masse for all the others who need to imagine their ancestors. Portraits of relatives in their village was one kind of photo. Passport and identity photos collected and pasted into family albums were another. Identity photographs are complicated. Here's a portrait, a single photograph or sometimes a contact sheet that represents your entire identity before the law. Even for a generation that was not selfie-obsessed, being tied to a single likeness in an era where professional photographs were more difficult to come by was nerve-wracking. Identity portraits are taken infrequently. They serve as the most accurate, if not flattering, record of your existence. And how quickly they become dated. I mean, just look at my own passport photo a month before graduating high school. What shocked me was the sheer number of passport photos I discovered in my own family's archive, as if domestic photographs were somehow not documentary enough. These images, taken by a professional, were the most official documentation of one's existence. First and foremost, the subjects are aware they're being photographed, and thus have control over how they present themselves to the camera. They mediate their image, and later curate if and how it appears when organizing albums to be passed to future generations. Identity photographs are thus the most direct and aesthetically composed images that my family chose to be remembered by, a record suggesting we were here. So I've been experimenting using masks and mannequins to recreate such portraits. My collaborators were not always made of plastic or latex, however, but included friends and family as well. You won't find a single subject not in disguise, however. And you can see I got a little carried away. So working with these masks presented another interesting opportunity because they looked so different depending on the wearer. The same mask could be worn twice and produce entirely different effects, evident in these two portraits. And that is my dad on the right-hand side. The features are strikingly similar, though not identical, allowing me to create relationships between the fictional characters in the images, in this world that I created. In this case, the photographs might suggest a father and son relationship. So, father's on the left, son's on his right. The photos might have been taken around the same time. Or even a younger self versus older self, as we shed wing. The editing of the photographs and the way they're going to be printed will together make it seem like the images were taken in different time periods. And I've also begun experimenting with more formal studio portraits. These are the most recent images, taken just a few days ago. They're based on a series of photographs of my grandfather and my grandma, who passed away when my mother was 7. Candid photographs taken on a weekend snow day featured the family unit together, even if it would not survive for much longer. A sequence of photographs shot in succession or presented as a triptych suggests movement, animation falsely created from the rapid release of a shutter, breathing life into individuals I never knew, and my mother hardly remembers. Here I was, at the doorstep of my living mother's childhood, recreating moments of bliss from the infancy her memory chooses not to recall. I could read my non-existence in the clothes my mother had worn before I can remember her, wrote legendary philosopher and theorist Roland Barthes, as he searched through family photographs from before his birth. His mother was ill at the time of the writing, and in one particular snapshot, he recognized his mother as a 5-year-old girl, standing with her brother in the winter garden of their family home. Barthes tells us that the young child rejoins the frail old woman he nursed through her last illness. She had become my little girl, he writes, uniting for me with that essential child she was in her first photograph. So here's the group portrait. It's terrifying. I think of that quote when I turn to this photograph, which is not really part of the series, snapped on my iPhone a few years before my grandfather passed. A now famous snapshot of him wearing a fedora and suit is held up before the 84-year-old man. I asked him how old he was in this picture, imagining a man in his 20s or maybe early 30s, married with 2 children. I was 17, he told me instead. I drew on a fake mustache and put on a suit to look like I was from the past. He never lived to see his grandson follow in these footsteps. There's only so much to be revealed from these family photographs, however. I was more interested in hearing stories from the living, however biased they may be. I spent time filming interviews with family members about their lives pre, during, and post-immigration. And they were seated around the kitchen tables, an icon of Soviet culture representing free and intimate conversation. And then I recreated these interviews word for word in a Soviet apartment set I constructed, performing both as my family members and myself before the camera with the help of costumes, makeups, prop, and some tricks in video editing software. And though it appears as though there are 2 people speaking, I am playing both roles for the camera. I'm interested in the performative aspects of oral history and testimony as subjective recollections. And by repeating the mannerisms, the sentiments, and anecdotes word for word, I aim to arrive at a greater understanding of the experiences that molded my relatives' identities. So here's the part where I completely embarrass myself. In this first clip, I portrayed my Aunt Evelyn, seen as a little girl in the black and white snow photographs. So she's the 10-year-old. 50 years later, she recalls the anti-Semitism she lived through in her home country.
Now, having grown up in such an anti-Semitic country, were you aware that that existed around you?
Absolutely, absolutely. When I was a child, the boy, the neighbor, he told something to me. He came over and he took chalk, white chalk, and he drew a swastika on the back of my coat. It had like a fur coat, very polished fur coat my mother brought to me. So he drew it. And his father was kind of, I don't know, some very high position in the police department or something like that. So my father wasn't scared of him. He came over to him. He took him like this. He never left traces on the skin or anything. He took him like this and said, "You motherfucker," in Russian, of course. I mean, I don't care who your father is. Next time you come over to my girl, I'm going to kill you, and nobody will find you, okay? It's understood? He said, yes, yes, sir, yes. And I never see him on my horizon again. That was when I was little. I was like 6 or 7 years old. Of course, I hated this country because of that, because all of them, they hated us from the very beginning they were born. They knew exactly, my parents didn't look Jewish, never, but they knew exactly we were Jewish.
Now, this was when you were younger. As you got older and you became more aware, how did your perception, your understanding of the situation change as a Soviet Jew? That you were a Soviet Jew?
Imagine. My father and I, we came to register for my college. And I brought all my papers, my gold medal certificate, all certificate that I won Olympic game in math, in English, whatever. And that guy took my papers, he wrote down everything that I brought to him, and he said, "This is a list of your papers, in case you're not going to get accepted." And he knew for sure that I would not get accepted. You will take all your papers back using this list. So he knew for sure that it's not going to happen, that I will get accepted to that particular university, that particular group. And my father was sitting like this, and I saw that one more word from that guy, he's gonna punch him, because he used to do boxing. One more word for that, because I was almost crying. I almost cried. And when it was over, because my father pulled all strings to have me accepted to that college, and he said, don't worry, don't even look at him, don't pay attention to him, he's nobody, he's nothing, he's just motivated piece of shit. And everything will be fine with you. Everything is taken care of. It doesn't matter what he's saying. And when I got accepted, my father was standing behind a glass wall like this, and I told him, when I look at that list of who got accepted, he was looking like this behind the glass wall, and he was almost crying. My mom lost her consciousness at work when somebody told her, because it was so important.
You can imagine how terrifying it was actually showing this to my family. So I have one more clip. And by the way, the man that keeps cursing was my grandfather, like that you saw that drew on the fake mustache. That is who she's referring to. The cultural trauma of post-memory lives on in generations beyond my own, of course. In this excerpt, my step-grandmother recounts stories from the Holocaust, stories she learned later, as she was only 2 when her family found itself in the ghetto.
Скажи, у тебя есть какие-то воспоминания с этих лет? Ну, как тебе сказать, те воспоминания никакие не имела, потому что когда закончилась война, мне было 2 года. Понимаешь как? Я все это говорю со слов родителей. Они рассказывали, что там было. А это была открытая тема в вашей семье? Очень хорошо, что ты задал этот вопрос. Что я да помню, когда я была ребенком, даже 5-6 лет, постоянно мои родители говорили, чтобы я никому не рассказывала, что мы были в гетто. Это было очень опасно для нашей семьи. Поэтому эта тема даже не поднималась. То есть дома не было разговора об этом? Когда я стала старше, когда мне было 5-6 лет, говорили, если тебя спросят, не были ли в гетто, говори, не знаю. А когда я стала старше, так вот это все мне уже рассказывали. Уже когда я понимала больше, где-то в 7-8 лет, мне начали рассказывать.
So, the 3 40-minute-long interviews I recreated are going to be presented as these brief excerpts, because I went through the whole interviews. And they're not perfect. There's still a lot of editing to be done. And like the photographs, they're chock full of errors that could only be made by someone that heard stories of Russian life, but did not experience them. The Soviet apartment set, for instance, is not entirely historically accurate. My posture in the videos reveals that of a man. Thank you, Professor Van Busker, for that. And my Russian is not as candid as I'd like it to be, but that's okay. The apprehension and misapprehension of events that Leo Spitzer described are inherent to post-memory and those that live in its consequences. Of course, I'm only the most recent in a long line of crazy artists that have explored similar themes, but it would be foolish to believe that producing truly original work is possible. Jacob de Leche, for example, photographed a young mother fleeing across the border into West Germany, and like my own work, titled his image with a false date to blur the line between documentary and fiction, studio backdrop, and Cold War Germany. Rie Yamada reenacted found family photos from flea markets and antique shops. Jamie Dimon hired actors to perform as family members and recreated memories from her childhood. She's a brilliant artist and dear friend. Laurel Nakadate asked the internet to Photoshop pictures of her son into vintage snapshots of her mother's life, as the two never got to meet in person. Gillian Wearing recreated photographs directly from her family's photo album, using hyper-realistic silicone masks and careful staging, to the point where you cannot discern original from reproduction. And so these are all these crazy hyper-realistic masks. Like if you look, this is herself as a 3-year-old. If you look around the eyes, you can see that it's actually a mask. And this is her as her father and her as herself from age 17. And even the idea of cloning oneself in film or photography dates to images Hippolyte Bayard produced in the mid-19th century, and Anthony Goicolia reinvented 150 years after him. I will finish here, at the photograph of a faded 19th century daguerreotype I purchased on eBay. I wanted it to appear as though the artificial family I have created managed to preserve a single photograph from the 1800s. Instead, I discovered that my $25 purchase was one of a faded image. But what's funny is that it doesn't matter whose likeness was once depicted on the other side, only to make its way into my hands however many years later. Erasure is a fate that awaits almost every photograph, both analog and digital. Photos fade, files get lost or deleted, and humans fade even quicker. But the best part about the little daguerreotype, the plate the image was printed on now functions as a mirror. In an effort to find someone from the past, I am left looking at myself.